Yeah.
Cool. So if we had like one perfect top level domain, like I think you know I would be super happy with the idea that okay, let's just like .eth and that's it, and then everything else you can just nest underneath. But like if we're gonna have uncertainty about whether it's the best or then there might be some debate about the benefit from diversity and having like choices and trying different things. Although maybe we're willing to settle for okay, good enough rather than optimal. And that's a discussion I think we're gonna have over the next like 2 days, this afternoon, etc.
Yeah. Really quickly, I think what could be done is you just, in my mind, I've been treating .eth like the root, like the internet root. And so to me, so I got this idea that I keep sounding people out about, what if we got rid of not got rid of, forget that, sorry, but if you used a blockchain as an internet root, not to replace the existing legacy DNS, we could put it on top. And we call, and that's ENS and that's .eth. And you do, maybe you say, we are gonna have multiple TLDs, and they're gonna have different governance structures, they're gonna have different incentive structures, and they're gonna have different, and you let the marketplace of ideas, who gets the adaptation, who gets abused the most, and you sort of balance it out with things like reputation, policy zones, and things like that. But then you can have TLDs under .eth, and .eth could almost be abstracted away from the end user. So you could have .gps or .rfid or something, but in the practice, at the contracts, it would be like rfid.eth, but ETH is our blockchain root.
That's what I've been thinking about it.
Yeah.
And that kind of is what happens, only instead of .eth being the root, there's like a root multi-sig, it's actually the root. Right, it's like .nothing or .slash, how do you think of it?
Oh,
sure. Is it the empty string?
It's the empty string.
The empty string, okay.
Yeah.
Dot the
So
empty
that's
string,
the root.
and then we just kind of like omit the dot for
It's the hash, yeah. The empty string is the root.
Yeah, the hash of the root is 0. Like all zeros.
Okay.
Rather than that being the SHA hash of the empty string.
And what is the SHA hash of the empty string? I didn't know that.
I think it starts with C and has.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
You've got a tattoo.
You're gonna be really salty when they
That's not a. That's
When they change
force SHA-3. Yeah. So I mean, I guess this is a good time to bring up
use multi-formats.
future developments of TLDs and so on. The main reason we use .eth and rather than just directly off the root is because we really want to avoid collisions with the ICANN namespace as much as possible. And that's why there isn't a proliferation of TLDs at the moment. Again, precautionary principle, it's easier to add more TLDs later than it is to remove them. What we've learned since launch is realistically, .eth is not likely to become resolvable on DNS anytime in the foreseeable future. This is partly because ICANN has no plans to allow new top-level domain registrations or GTLD registrations before 2020 at the very earliest. But this is also largely because, and this is a fact we discovered after launch, ICANN has proactively reserved all 3-letter country code TLDs for those countries, despite no country actually using 3-letter top-level domains, which means that in order to get .eth registered as GTLD, we would have to get a letter of non-objection from Ethiopia.
I bet you could do it.
Yeah, no, we should do that. It's better that we do that.
Yeah. So there's sort of several ways to look at this. One is that's unlikely. The other is probably with enough money and effort we can make it happen.
What do you mean? Don't we just have to promise them blockchain?
We've got one of them.
And the third is that if we can't do it, probably nobody else can, and they're unlikely to want it as a second top-level domain, so at least we're reasonably safe against collisions. So the short term, if somebody wants to go petition the government of Ethiopia, I will get behind you. I would love to see this happen. But
are they using their two-letter one or no?
They are.
They are .et.
.et, okay.
And even
No, sorry. That's why I know it, because I wanted my etherwall.ut. Oh, this might not. Okay, so they started releasing them or selling them to the government agencies. And then they stopped because people like me wanted them. Like everyone wanted like a .ut like that. And they basically just like turned it off because like 90% of Ethiopia doesn't have internet or something. And they basically, it's just used right now. The .ut is just used for like a couple government sites, the internal like government emails, and like they're not registering any new ones. Like you literally can't get anything except you can do, I think, a dot, there's one of the registrars that does the .et.co or something, or .co.et or something.
Yeah.
So you can get those, but you can't, yeah.
So if there's a location like Tokyo or London which has a domain, you can ask. Because in France there's a city called ETH.
Yes.
Can they be legitimate rather than Ethiopia?
I think they would also need to get a letter of non-objection from Ethiopia.
Yeah.
Probably they would find it easier.
Yeah, as part of the applicant guidebook, it's like, these are the restrictions on UTLDs, right? No three-letter ISO codes for any country, and then a bunch of other.
I mean, as I understand it, if we could get a letter of no objection, then that would basically mean we were the only contestants for that name, which is a good thing. Even on the more extremely unlikely end, if the government of Ethiopia wanted to cooperate with us to build a blockchain registry, then that would be almost the only way to get a new TLD registered before 2020. So, on the ridiculously unlikely scenario there.
Well, so a couple of things that I thought about was like, so number one, how committed are we to getting, legacy group visibility for a domain? Because one of the things that I might end up talking about is that we don't actually need that for everyone who's plugging into Ethereum to actually have visibility into the entire namespace, which is kind of really neat. It's one of the reasons I'm here, because when I suddenly understood what was happening, I was like, I gotta go to this thing. And the other thing is, if we do want it, which I think it would be neat, this is almost like a bureaucratic typo kind of issue. Are we early enough in the game here that we could just say, even if you kept .eth for ENS, you come up with some other TLD namespace that will pass all of the requirements of the new TLD applicant guidebook, and you can put into the legacy roots, and then
or a non-TLD, right? I mean, I know it's currently out there and being sold and something, but if someone picked up Ethereum.com, we could hang .eth off Ethereum.com.
You could put it off of a legacy one.
It doesn't have to be its own top-level domain. But that's the question is, firstly, do we care about DNS? Do we want to integrate with DNS? Because if someone's going to be looking up an address, a name to get an address, they're going to be on Ethereum anyway. So, ENS resolution is actually relatively painless when you've got the libraries in place.
Yeah.
And obviously we can expand ENS. I know we've got APIs in there and all that type of stuff. So yes, you can put arbitrary data in there.
Yeah.
But is there any real value to Ethereum as a whole to actually allow this stuff to be resolvable through DNS? And like we said, it would take, half an hour to spin up something that you could resolve off the back end of myethereumnames.com, and actually that can map to .eth, and then you can pull it out that way, right? So we can do it.
I think it's actually two separate conversations. Like,
So
resolution via DNS back and forth, yeah, I think, because once you get smart contracts involved, you can actually put processing logic into DNS query hookups, which to me is like, yes.
Sorry, can you expand on that, please?
So nowadays you do a DNS lookup and you get an answer, and the fanciest you can get is like GeoDNS, or maybe load balanced, DNS load balancing. That's about as fancy as you can get, putting some logic behind your responses to DNS queries, right? Here's the query, here's the response.
Okay, now I got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Cool. So you can do load balancing You
Yeah,
can
well,
smart
you
contract.
can do
other things.
Anything you can put in a smart contract, you can put in between a DNS lookup.
You could give everyone the same IP except for this one guy. Or because you provide the secret to the back door, you know, like.
Bear in mind though, we've always been able to do that with DNS, and we just never have, right? Anyone can write their own resolver in DNS.
Well, yes and no, because,
right?
because how do you key your responses in DNS? All you know is the IP of the resolver. That's it. That's the only thing you can key on, right? You can't say, if this guy is in my contact list, send him this address, but only for MX lookups. For A records, I want to do this.
From within Ethereum resolvers, you don't even get that. You have nothing.
True.
You can look up locally on Exchange.
But you are coming through it via a smart contract, aren't you? Isn't there a contract
Well,
address
it
that you're
doesn't-
coming through?
You do know, generally, if somebody does a resolution on their own, through their own Web3 instance, it will be from the address they own. If it's a local call, so you can't write any data out, but you can still condition it on who's doing the resolution.
But that could be anything in a completely unrestricted manner. I can create a new address,
Yeah.
do a query. So anything that you're trying to use that as, it's a generic Ethereum problem, right? An address can be anything. We don't know who it is,
And
where it is,
plus,
what it
in the
is.
response, you could say, I'm not giving you a response unless you give me more in your query. I don't want to give you a response unless I know who you are, where you are, why you're asking, what you want, and how long you're going to use it for.
I mean,
Otherwise, I'm going to give you a no response.
Still doable under standard DNS, right?
How?
There's some quick ways
Write
that.
their own resolver. We just write their own resolver.
Right, but it'd be closed, right?
No, because the responses come from the authoritative name server side. And you're sitting there and all you are seeing are a bunch of queries coming in and the IP address of the resolver they're coming from. And you have no other information about who's making that query.
You can look across multiple queries, so I can request, so I can request some funny record. And I say, oh, okay, if I see a request from some funny record before, and then like a minute later, I see a request for like a normal record. That's I can like condition on the
You
earlier.
could, but that's kind of jerry-rigging it. Now, I gotta caveat this with, I may profoundly be misunderstanding how Ethereum works, okay? So I'm the guy who took 5 days to get Geth up and running before I came here, okay? So
At least you did it.
That was just thinking.
yeah, no, but I mean, you know, the way I understand it is that because it's all smart contracts, right? It's like the registry is a smart contract, the resolvers are smart contracts, the names are addresses, and you can put the processing logic in there before your authoritative name server or before your smart contract gives a response.
So I see sort of two key differences to DNS here. One is that you can assume something about the sender of the message when you're doing a resolution being the person who's actually wanted to resolve the name, as opposed to some recursive resolver down the line that's doing caching for you. The other is that you can push out your complicated load balancing logic to the edges without having to write and deploy your own special resolver that every secondary resolver has to support and so on. So you can write arbitrarily complicated logic and know that the edge resolvers will implement it for you, which currently would require pushing out special software to everyone on traditional DNS. Is that more or less in line with what?
It sounds like it, yeah.
I was just gonna say that smart contracts don't really have privacy, and so you could, if what you're trying to do is only give access to certain registrations to certain people sometimes, you know, you may not be able to do it just like that. But there are certain things you might be able to do.
I'm not talking about registrations, though, I'm talking about, so this is what I'm talking about, so we're not talking about looking up Ethereum addresses or swarms or anything like that. I'm talking about you're just taking this to the DNS, sort of like you're asking for DNS type RRs.
Yeah. So I think the current model for that is that like, all we really need is a name associated with cryptographic credentials, and then you can just sign a record of all the different entries that you want with those credentials. So somehow if you map names to cryptographic credentials, you get a lot more freedom than if you map names to like keys and then have a certificate authority system on top.
Yeah. Right.
And so the kind of the way that things factor out ends up looking different because we get to map names to credentials. we don't actually need to think about all the different types of registries, because we can kind of put them in at a different layer in the stack.
Right.
So I think it helps to break down sort of the two things that ENS can do and the two things that, which is basically ENS as originally conceived as primarily for resolving blockchain resources, Ethereum resources such as addresses, swarm hashes, and so forth, which is a completely unserved market prior to ENS. Nobody, there was no way to name those resources consistently and have global accessibility. And it can be used to resolve legacy resources such as DNS, so we can develop DNS bindings. And then also from the DNS point of view, there's two things you can do with ENS. One is expose ENS records, such as blockchain addresses on legacy DNS, and the other is host legacy DNS records on ENS so that they can be accessed anywhere. And I think the former is less useful. Like there's relatively little use for me looking up my wallet address via DNS, because if I already have Ethereum, I may as well use ENS, and if I don't, then why do I need the address in the first place? But the latter of using ENS as a backend for DNS infrastructure has, I think, a lot of promise. You can do neat things like have the same level of security as DNSSEC, but without a trusted certificate hierarchy and without having to trust the root. You can replace the entire SSL certificate hierarchy with self-signed certificates and know that they're actually representative of the domain you're looking at. So I think there's a hell of a lot of promise there for improving name resolution on the wider internet. But I think we need to sort of make sure that we focus on, we're explicit about what we're focusing on. Are we building out the parts of ENS that relate to name resolution on the Ethereum chain, or are we building out, the integration with the DNS hierarchy? And I think both are valuable, and can be pursued in parallel, but they're differently separate efforts.
I would say they should be totally separate contracts. And
I don't think I agree with that.
Well, so
I don't see any reason to do so.
So here's it's a thing that I kind of realized a while ago when I was learning about DNS. There's a lot of different types of records that DNS holds, and I'm not actually sure that are you thinking about all of these records when you say that?
So,
or are you thinking only about like
A records and so on?
Yeah, exactly.
So the way I've explored it so far is to simply embed serialized resource records from DNS inside ENS. And that way there's no reason that the ENS resolver generally needs to decode all of these, it just needs to serve them up, and the legacy resolvers already know what to do with them.
Okay.
But that's all ridiculously early, like as in I knocked together some Go code over a weekend and played with it a bit. So it's far less developed than other aspects of ENS, and I really hope some here are enthusiastic about building that out in the future. Getting back briefly to the whole TLD thing, one thing Virgil and I have been, I don't know where he's gone, there we go, have been pursuing is the idea of working with an existing TLD, and I'm going to screw up the terminology here, registry, with an existing GTLD and effectively blockchain enabling that, which would then allow us to add that as a new root level domain in ENS, and anyone who owns that domain on the ICANN root would also be able to set ENS records. And that would provide us with a way to make these globally rootable. And then also potentially from there to build out the integrations that you can host your authoritative DNS records in ENS and have that registry serve up the glue records and so on from there.
There's a couple of TLDs that might be receptive to that. So .to is Kingdom of Tonga, but it's run by a couple of Californians. Yeah, Eric, they had a handshake deal with the king back in the mid-90s, and they've been running it ever since. Actually, Barbados is really hip to blockchain technology. Like the only country that wrote, their central bank has a guy who wrote a white paper about holding Bitcoin as a central bank reserve, a portion of it, and they're pretty surprisingly up on it.
We should definitely stand on that later. Can we talk about Nepal, do you think?
So about the what?
Nepal?
Oh yeah, of course.
So We've been invited to the yearly Asia Pacific CCTLD conference in Nepal next year to give a 2-hour workshop teaching CCTLD registries how to use blockchain and telling them about ENS. So I think there's potential there.
Yeah, no, we're kind of excited about that. I mean, especially in that region, they like to kind of like one up each other. No, I mean this very sincerely. I mean, as far as like, I mean, sort of like a lot of the, usually they kind of make their TLD, but they don't actually really like they're mostly bored, you know, and they want like interesting things to do. So we're like, oh, well, you know, we can give you that, and they're like, oh, and then it'll be more hip than my neighbors. They're like, it will, you know, and they're like, oh, well, you know, let me, I'm intrigued, you know, and so hopefully that might go somewhere. But yeah, no, I like the idea of looking outside Asia as well. I mean,
Estonia has been traditionally ahead of the curve on everything in this kind of department.
That's true. I'd be inclined to say that Estonia is too well developed. Like a .D wanted to do ENS, I mean, we would decline, like because like it's too much. We want something like small.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So
you're talking about number of records that we can.
Yeah. I mean, just I start something small. I mean, something like Tonga would be better than Estonia.
You're worried we'll load the entire German internet registry to.
I mean, that just sounds I mean, start small. I mean, I'd much rather do a TLD for like some weird island country than do either for Ethiopia than.
The guy who runs Bit.com, which is a Bitcoin exchange in the Caribbean, based out of Barbados, he's setting up like a plain Jane legacy registrar, domain registrar for as many of the Caribbean countries as he can, right?
Yeah, I don't know. Put us in touch. Put us in touch.
Yeah, I'm gonna see him in a couple of weeks.
Oh, well, almost said hi.
So I'd like to put a bookmark in some of this for later because we've got between now and lunch to sort of do an informal postmortem on the ENS launch. So I'd really love to hear from everyone here what you think better about the ENS launch, what worked particularly well and should be reused later, and what you think we've learned from how it went and how that should influence how we change the registrar in the future. One of my pet things, as I mentioned earlier, is whether or not we should do a short-term transition to a non-auction based registrar based on the stats we saw there. So any thoughts?
A lot of TLD rollouts do it in like sunrise phase, which you could equate with this whole soft launch auction thing, and then they go to land rush again, which
Explains itself.
Yeah.
So we've seen that since July. Nearly all the names we claimed were without competition. So we bid and then we go through the process, and we get all the names for 0.01.
So you're talking specifically post soft launch.
Yeah, post soft launch.
Okay. So that lines up with.
Yeah. For us it will be great.
One of the main gripes that I've had with the whole process is everyone refers to it as buying a name or as having so somehow we use the language of purchase when really we should be using language of right to place a deposit, right? And I think that's really misleading for people, and I think it really kind of masks a lot of the unfairness that I see in the ENS auction mechanism. People do not have the same cost of capital. People's cost for 1 Ether varies much less than people's cost of capital for 1 Ether for 1 month, right? I mean, if you're long Ether, you might not even have a significant cost of capital because you're already locked in, right? Whereas if you have a few hundred Ether or tens of Ether or you're not that wealthy of a person, right? Your cost of capital is going to be relatively much higher.
We've had support tickets at Crypto Compare about people that wanted to specifically lock their Ether so they don't sell it. So specifically lock it for a year. So their cost of capital was nothing.
Yeah.
They just wanted to use the service to lock their Ether.
Yeah.
So people might find this entertaining, which is something we came across yesterday. This is peer name, and they are offering .eth domains on a very interesting principle, which is that's probably taken, but They'll let you add the name to your cart, and they offer discounts, and you can register for up to 10 years, which really interests me because I didn't think we allowed registrations for 10 years. But apparently that hasn't deterred them from selling it to people.
So a lot of registrars, they'll sell you a 10-year domain registration, and then they'll turn around to the registry and register it for 1 year, and then they'll renew it each year for the rest of the 9-year term, and they kite the money in between, right? They'll just stick it in the GIC, so we're giving them an interest-free loan for 10 years.
So they're selling you convenience of not having to worry about it, basically. But I'm not sure how I envisage that happening when we literally, the people in this room who should be the best informed in the world don't know, what it'll look like in 3 years.
So they're offering .bit registrations too.
Yes, and .onion, which is even more confusing.
It is actually super confusing.
Yeah.
What are they gonna do? Like brute force, like a vanity name for you, and then give you your credentials?
Price goes up.
That sounds like a great service.
And it kind of is. Like, you have to figure it out so that the credentials don't compromised, right? You can't have them own the private key associated with your.
Do they use?
Oh, well, see, I mean, 99% of users don't know what a private key is, so it doesn't matter.
Maybe I'm misunderstanding how John is.
No, your reading is correct.
Yeah.
Does Tor use ECDSA?
Yeah.
Does Tor use ECDSA?
So for .onion, they say we'll mine names beginning with easy DNS and send you the private key at the card.
Yes, the same with that.
So the private key, they have the private key, your email has a private key. Anywhere you logged in, your email has a private key.
Sorry, and they have a watermark, or they'll register they'll do your name, right?
Yeah, so I typed easydns.onion,
okay.
and they said, we will mine domains beginning with easydns.
Right,
and
okay,
cool.
Okay, that's cool. Didn't we talk about vanity mining?
It is possible on Ethereum, for instance, to do trustless vanity mining, because you can generate your own private key and send them the public key, and then they can use that and generate their private keys and multiply it with the public key to generate vanity addresses.
And then you add your private keys together, and
Yes.
then
So they send you the other part, yeah.
hopefully they figure out how to do that.
It doesn't sound like they're doing it.
It doesn't sound like they're doing it.
We talked earlier about mechanism design and how people come up with these beautiful mechanisms that nobody can figure out how to use. This may well be one of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the nice thing about like our setting is that like we get to have like a lot of software help, where like hopefully like people don't need to understand as long as their software understands, as long fingers crossed, right? I mean, I don't know.
So back to you.
Okay, so the auction stuff you were discussing about whether you move away from the auction because no one's bidding. Currently, so my Ether wallet and there's a registrar specific website you can auction. What other place you can actually still do the auction?
So that I know of, registrar.ens.domains, my Ether wallet, Leth has their own app, Token released their own app for it, and there's another site whose name I forget also offers support, and it turns out their name will sell to you for 10 years.
So what I was thinking is because it almost spent like 3-4 months to educate people to how to use our auction mechanism.
Yes.
And back in the if we want to encourage like our ICO company to do some sort can we extract something like a generic auction mechanism if you want to bid some scarce resource, not on the time base but on the price base? Can you generalize it so like other mechanisms, not just ENS, but other mechanisms can utilize to basically discourage people just using time base, but you can also use price base. Then because it's already, that would be the good way to encourage all the wallet supplier to do the basic interface of anything ENS provide, but not just for ENS. If you can let ICO company to do, which is kind of kill up with the people like
a standardized auction contract.
Yeah. So that they might help for the greater good because you already proved that it's going to work. Can we do it for other purposes as well?
Yeah. So you're talking about generalizing the current auction system so that these interfaces people have built to be useful more widely. Is that right?
Correct.
And while you talk about that, it occurs to me that we're also talking about making all of those existing interfaces obsolete if we remove auction-based pricing. So that definitely means in my mind that if we did remove options, we should provide a legacy interface where people can still bid and reveal, but they're just basically guaranteed to get the name if they're the first person to bid.
But when you are releasing the shorter than 6 names, you need an auction again, right?
Yes,
So
absolutely.
It's nicer, and then if we start doing another top level domain or something, you might need it again. So it's a bit unfortunate if you
You're right. We definitely should throw it out. Yeah.
The reason why you want to get rid of the auction though is because it's a bunch of complexity where people might hurt themselves by not revealing, and the bids are so low, right?
Well, hang on, but if the bids are so low, then the pain they get by not revealing is limited.
Yes,
That's
but you still have the complexity.
Well, that
No,
really low,
right?
it's really low.
So how much
but not
is it
really
for
low to them necessarily.
Yeah.
And that's
Right, so
a lot.
your not your bid, but your mask bid, your entire mask.
If you reveal late, you still get your mask back. If you don't reveal at all, you don't get the mask back.
Okay.
So if you
But
lose,
if you reveal late, you lose your bid.
yes.
Okay.
Is
So
there
you
any
might lose a
reason-
lot, even though
Yeah.
no
if
one's bidding against
If you bid 10 ether and nobody bid against you, you could still lose, or sorry, one person bids against you, you could still lose 10 ether, even though the name went for 0.01 ether.
I think it was well done, like I forget what you called it, that type of auction where the second highest.
Vickery auction.
I'm sorry.
A Vickery auction.
Yeah, I thought that was well.
I think it's a good piece of mechanism design. I mean, my name isn't Vickery, so I can't really take credit.
Yeah, I mean, good piece of mechanism design is an understatement.
Yeah.
Provably optimal piece of mechanism design.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we have this huge problem with revealing. Revealing is like the biggest thing. Is there any reason that like you can't reveal when you bid? Like, yes, it's a blind, but like if I don't care about that, like if I just am like, I don't care, I'll reveal it right now, why not?
Yeah, it does ruin the game theory.
We prohibited it because we knew it would be a sort of a community bad. Even if you don't care about it, it compromises the auction as a whole.
How? Because the next
So
participant knows what
Yeah.
to do.
if you know everyone else's reveals,
This is it.
How do you know they're revealed though? So it's like,
because they decided they didn't care and they just revealed it away.
so you know one person.
If you don't suppose you knew everyone else's.
Yeah.
You know one person.
You don't, right? You never know who hasn't revealed.
Yeah.
You do know how many bids there were.
So
and
it's
you
optional.
don't. Oh, cool. Cool. Great. Oh, great. So
you know.
Yeah,
how
that's
you
the
have
main thing
revealed.
is that this is like what boggled my mind when I first like started figuring out the ENS. Was like you don't know how many people have bid on the name. You don't know anything. Like I keep saying this like to the users. It's like truly you're blind. You like go into a room and you figure out how much this is worth to you and you bid that and that's all you've got because you don't have any other information. So when you do things like reveal early or like whatever, it just changes the entire game. Like maybe that's not bad, maybe that's fine, but
I'm not
it
sure.
just changes it. And you know suddenly that like, I mean, even knowing, so like when we were bidding on my Ether wallet, for example, right? We knew when it was going to be released, but like I wanted to know when someone else would put the first bid. Like we didn't make the first bid. So it took like 5 hours for someone to bid on, like put the first bid in. And that's the only piece of information we had, was that it took 5 hours for someone to place the first bid. Now I know at least one person has bid on it besides us.
Or at least they open the auction. Right?
Yeah,
You don't
not
know
even
that.
that, yeah,
Right, yeah.
exactly.
So do the companies that operate in this space, like, do you have a trademark on my Ether wallet? Do you have a trademark on MetaMask and?
We don't have a formal trademark, but we got the ETH name.
Yeah, we have one.
You got what matters.
Yeah.
We have a Swiss, I'm just wondering because
We
like
have a Swiss
sometimes.
trademark and we have a pending US one, international one or
No, but you have
whatever.
a Swiss one, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, because a lot of times.
We
you
use
say
the
that
Swiss
it's
one for the
sunrise.
phishing sites all the time.
I mean, some people get pissed off during TLD rollouts that they say, well, it favors the trademark holders if you do Sunrise, or you favor the trademark holders, but that, you know, the consensus community said, that's the whole point of having
Yeah.
a trademark, is to be able to assert your IP rights. And it doesn't matter if it's Swiss or whatever, because
Yeah.
when we do these things, I mean, I remember .biz and it was a huge mess, but you know, you had to fill out this form and it was like, where's your trademark, what country is it in, and all that stuff, and then, you know, and it went, and then it's triggered an auction process if you had multiple trademark holders going for it, but
then again, this, this especially in here, in this space, this is like moving so fast, a lot of people don't have trademarks yet.
Yeah. And I think something worth addressing in the afternoon session too is whether trademarks are representative of the types of IP, all the types of IP you want to protect, because there's a lot of uses for ENS that don't necessarily line up with DNS uses, or are less common in DNS, like vanity names. And there may be legitimate rights to a name that you use exclusively that somebody else has registered purely to stop you from using it, even though most people don't trademark their nicknames or their Reddit handles or whatever.
Well, dispute resolution processes keep a lot of people busy.
Yes. And it's going to keep all of us busy all afternoon.
So just back to the reviewing stuff. People forget to review because there's a 3 days period. If you want to avoid that, can you just change it to 2 minutes or 3 minutes so that you still keep exactly the same interface, but
then everyone needs to submit their bids in these two minutes after the auction opens.
Spikes.
Sorry? No, I think currently, so the reason you want to get rid of the auction system itself is no one's auctioning anymore. So if you just want to kind of disable rather than doing the big shift on changing how people do, they spend 3-4 months just learning how to do this period. So if you just adjust the time, you still do the same auction process, but it doesn't.
A 5-minute auction, which by default becomes
first
1
come,
minute. I think it's a reasonable way to avoid, but that and something like it is a reasonable way to avoid obsoleting a lot of existing code. But ultimately, for usability's sake, a lot of these sites are going to have to update anyway, because one of the goals, besides nobody's auctioning stuff, is simplifying registration. Ideally, you want it to be one transaction with one operation from the user. Give me this name, here's my deposit. But it does introduce a whole lot of other issues too. Like, one of the really nice things about the auction system is it allowed price discovery. It was possible to discover, like, we set a de facto 0.01 minimum bid, and that was reasonably easy to set because over the few months that the auction was initially running, price was relatively stable. But that's not a long-term solution, because 0.01 ETH will vary hugely over the next 10 years or even less than that. So if we're going to abandon auctions, we need some way to set the price that's fair as well.
You said it's de facto. Isn't it de jure?
Yes, I suppose so.
Okay.
It's to something.
It's the law.
Nick, does the submitter of a bid, is he the only person who can then reveal that bid, or can anyone reveal it?
Yes, only the submitter can reveal.
Anyone who has what we
Yeah,
said.
I don't have access to their address too.
They need to have the seed, the amount, and the sender.
But the transaction also has to come from that account.
Oh,
It does?
Yes.
Okay.
So they have their string.
Which surprising people sometimes can't do. They don't remember. I mean, it's not that they forget their address, it's that they don't remember which address they did from. And so, they're like, okay, can you send me your info, or, and I'll go look at their transaction history. I'm like, you don't have any interactions with ENS on this account, but, I mean, that's the thing, it's like a lot of people, when they can't reveal and we couldn't help them and it was lost, it's like, that's a possibility, I'm like, there's so many variables that are up in the air. And even ones that you really wouldn't expect are still up in the air.
I think it incentivizes a central solution. Eventually, someone that will come in and allows users to register,
Yes.
their contact info, and I don't really think that you can otherwise find a solution to this problem without with a nice user interface.
And we've seen a couple of solutions like that already. You tell us how much you want to bid, and we'll deal with the whole thing end to end, and then just give you the name at the end if you win. That peer names one had an interesting variation where you pay them $40, they put in a bid for $40, and then they pocket the difference between $40 and what it actually sold for. But they're selling simplicity, so yeah.
So I'm I don't really have a proposed solution there yet, but I know that just as a user, it's been, and I'm very technical, it's been very painful experience. Do you remember if you go and review the bead?
Nick, along those lines, something I mentioned to you in passing, I think you said it's not possible, but I always thought it would have been nice if there was a way to kind of check it off that said, auto reveal my bid, after the 3 days or something, so that I wouldn't have to remind myself to do it again.
It's not presently possible without some form of centralized service that broadcasts your reveal for you. It might be possible in future with ZK Snacks or something like it.
Parity has scheduled transactions.
Yeah, they have the alarm.
I'm not sure if Geth does.
No, it doesn't. But of course, it requires keeping your node online.
You have to keep it on.
And the
Absolutely,
ideal
yeah.
solution is not requiring reveal transaction at all.
Right.
I mean, how much would that, like, what's the value of that feature? Like that service?
It is the,
Like-
I can tell you, it's about
No,
80,000.
no.
Yeah.
I think I forgot to reveal a bid.
I mean, we've talked about it, I just,
Let's
it's
go.
a, there, yeah.
It's like-
Right now, you screw up your reveal, that's your fault. If we screw up your reveal, that's our fault. So now we have risk. Now you're chasing it, not us.
Yeah.
I
But
don't
it's
like that
only what
idea.
the,
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is like, we see the demand for it, and that's what we do, that's what all of our features are built like that, we're, like, people yell out enough, people don't.
There's a general argument for having a system out there somewhere that will do transaction on your behalf.
Yes.
In this case, the entire ENS process, but it's not the only place. We looked at ICOs and all that type of stuff. There is a need for such a service. As to how many people here would trust it is a different beast to how many people who currently have registered ENS
And
It already
So-
exists, I just haven't ever updated it or
There we
redeployed it in the
go.
last year.
Yeah, see, that's.
Well, you need to start with an ICO.
There's a GitHub issue that says, if you want to update this and redeploy it, I'll give you a significant ownership of it.
Right, and.
I point it to I get a question about it probably twice a week. Somebody might take me up on it.
And it may be possible to make a more ENS specific solution that can do something like someone else reveals on your behalf, but you have a contract that can punish them if they reveal ahead of time. If you can demonstrate knowledge of the secret before the time to reveal the secret has arrived, then that means they broadcast it and they get penalised in some fashion. But that's not something I or anyone that I know is explored in detail.
There's also a time lock crypto, also kind of an option. No, for real, it's an option. It just requires that you do a lot of work.
Yeah, and that you
But
start
but you could know other people start.
Somebody
Starts meeting. But it's okay if they start late, as long as.
Too late, otherwise you miss the reveal period.
Yeah, so but you can reveal whenever you want, right, as you set it up, right, so, but yeah, you're right, so if they start too late, so they gotta get a reward for getting it done before the reveal period ends.
Instead of that, you can do it halfway with essentially just a incremental release of private keys from a couple of different people by, what's the service? There's a service out there. You can effectively do time lock with it because they release a private key based on the yes or no answer. The idea is basically just releasing the public key ahead of time for the time, and then later you release the private key at that time.
Yeah.
And if you do that across a couple parties,
I wonder if
you
there's
get effective time lock encryption.
But that's right. It's just it's the kind of the proof of stake alternative to the proof of work time lock crypto in some way.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's any way to generalize BLS signatures for that. Getting into like greenfield cryptography research.
No, so the thing is, if you want to encrypt something, so there's different types of time crypto. There's like a crypto, like, oh, something will appear in the future and no one can predict it, versus I have something that people will be able to have generate later, right?
Mm-hmm.
For the encryption thing, if you're going to do some encryption, you need to have the value that's going to come out later at the start.
Well, I'm imagining, like with BLS, you can generate a random oracle that nobody knows the value ahead of time.
That's exactly the issue, yeah, because you need to know the value ahead of time in order to mask your value.
But is there a generalization of BLS in which you can generate, anyone can generate this complete chain of public keys, but the private keys get generated only as the signatures are signed?
you can break up ENS signatures, right? So I think there's like a root key and then you can divide it into pieces or something. So it's possible you sign something with that, and only once all the people sign.
Yes, yeah, that's the ring beacon.
But you're still,
I don't know if you're depending on
it's
all
still
of that.
new, it's still new information, right? And to you, you're not able to like mask your update with that.
No, well, the idea would be that if you can reveal the public key, you can encrypt something with that key, and it can only be revealed when the private key is discovered.
I see.
I
And
was
so you
doing
want
lots
the
of
private key to be
different
discovered at the end.
Yes.
Okay, but then you need to be able to construct the public key for,
Immediately,
yeah, okay, maybe.
Maybe, yeah.
So, yeah, probably not. We need to do at the moment.
No, absolutely, no. But if any cryptographers are listening on the street,
Just on the whole auction or not auction thing, I mean, I would say we have two issues. One is that we know that auctions are non-optimal in terms of usability for our end user. They can't just log on once, get a name, and they have to come back a few days later, and we know that's an issue.
It's interactive and stateful.
However, given that it sounds like, and this might change, it sounds like we're probably going to have that auction come back for smaller domain names. And given that it will require retooling once, if not twice, across the board to fix that, we think that the benefit of getting rid of auctions at the moment, for whatever short period it is until we've sorted out the registrar and released secure domain names and everything else, is actually going to be worth it.
I think it depends on how closely the post-auction system resembles the post-permanent registrar system. Like if the system we get by removing auctions looks very like the permanent registrar, then it's probably worth it. And if it's going to be yet another change, then it's really not.
So it sounds like the answer is, let's see what it looks like.
So maybe we have to put a pin in this until we discuss what the registrar should look like in more detail.
I just want to put one more option on the table, which is just changing the parameters a bit. I mean, dragging the reveal period out for longer, noticeably longer, or.
The trouble with that is I don't get my ENS name. If you drag it out for a month, you know, I can wait a month before I can do anything. We want to make it usable.
And then we get into different tweaks, which are letting it drag out when there is no other bid and nobody has revealed anything. But once the reveal process starts, then
You're talking about starting the reveal timer when the first bid is revealed?
But maybe with some cutoff so that, you know, if you still wait, 2 months, it still cuts you off. But if you bid, you're uncontested. You forget to reveal for a week because your dog died or whatever. Or just
I literally just forgot to reveal.
Oh, I have a name that I've forgotten 3 times.
Oh, we got it. And then we got it.
So it's just tweaking the parameters a little bit.
Yeah.
Most of the code still works because it's all the same mechanism.
I would say the time between reveal and finalize, that's giving people more time to reveal.
What about just going land rush? I mean, these guys are a good data point here, like no one's contesting domains anymore. They're all single bid registrations.
Oh, no, I'm just specifically, for right now, I we can do instant get and it would be fine in 99.9% of cases. I'm talking about when the next rush of names becomes available.
Oh, yeah.
Seriously, we need at least, I would say at least 7 days.
I would say more.
Yeah, I'd say more as well.
Yeah,
I mean, the summer is a trader thing.
Giving people a week to reveal?
It's not enough. It's more than that.
I think there's a
I think those are the let people reveal at the same time.
I mean, we gave them 2 days, that's 5 more days.
Okay, so here's the thing. We don't have to actually hammer this concept out. Now it's on the table. Everybody think about it.
I mean, I just think it's
on the link to the reveal period, surely if we've got lots of new support tickets, you've got some rough idea of what that tail looks like. The people come and get you 2 days after they should have revealed, 5 days after they've revealed. If you have basically no one turn up on the week after they should have revealed, then maybe a week.
Oh no! So the thing is that for us, it was the time sensitivity wasn't a problem of users. It was a problem of we can't answer that many. We were not prepared to answer 1,000 support tickets in a day. And with any other support ticket that you get, you're like, okay, if I don't answer a ticket right now, right? that person's gonna be alive tomorrow and they probably aren't gonna lose any money. Like maybe they don't get in on like an ICO, but that's about as bad as it gets. Like there's not like money hanging in the air if we don't answer their email. With ENS there was. Like there was real money hanging in the air, and it was like that hung over my freaking head hardcore. Like I was messed with me bad because I don't know, like I care about people and I care about lost money. And like when I would see an email that we got like 72 hours before, where it was like, man, like I wouldn't even look. I wouldn't even try to like brute force it because I didn't want to know if I could have saved it. You know what I mean? But it's like when that's 10 ETH, when it's 100 ETH, when it's like 1,000 ETH, like, and that we just didn't have time to respond. And like that person was, most people would go in a circle. They would like come to us. If they didn't hear from us, they would go to like the Gitter channel. They'd reach out to Nick. They'd reach out to MetaMask. They'd show up in our Slack, like different things like that. And those people, you know, could usually get help. But the people that really like, I feel like we failed were the people that the money was in the air. We probably could have brute forced it, or we probably could have gotten them the assistance that they needed. And like they had opened a ticket with us earlier, like before, and like we had answered it like within 12 hours. And like they just assumed that we would respond then. And by the time that they realized that we weren't gonna respond, like now they're like 5 hours from the reveal period being over. And now they're like kind of scrambling around trying to find anyone to help them. It's like, I mean, if you've hung out in the ENS Gitter channel, there's a lot of lost souls.
Your problem there though is if you're getting people who only try and reveal 12 hours before the end of the reveal period, it doesn't matter how long that reveal period is, they're still going to hit that problem 12 hours before the end.
How much of an error margin are you willing to give support?
Of everyone that missed ENS that we got tickets about, most people were within 24 hours. And if they weren't within 24 hours, they were like a month and a half. It wasn't like a little difference. But like most people, it's like they tried to sign in on one day and it was like the day before. So it was like that's most of our tickets.
I think the constraints for releasing shorter names are different. I think it's fine to extend the reveal and the bidding periods because nobody needs a 5-letter name tomorrow. But launching ENS from scratch, we wanted to actually get names out there and get people using the system, and that's not really a problem with extending it. So I think when that becomes an issue, the software will be more mature, and so there's fewer people will hopefully run into fewer bugs, and also there's no reason not to stretch it out as long as we need.
Well, I mean, even the fact that we now we have answers to these questions, like, so this is how support works, like for you guys that don't know. You start seeing a pattern of questions, and then you answer it a few times, and then you make a thing called the canned response, right? And then you improve that canned response over time. So basically, you know, after you've answered the same question about like 20, 30 times, you don't answer that question anymore. You have a canned response that basically gives them all the information they need in a very well organized fashion, and you just give them that, right? When we were doing ENS though, like, I mean, the first couple tickets that we had, I was like, hey Nick, I'll help. You know, and then Nick would give me the information, and then I would try to give the user the information, and then they would come back to me with questions, and then I'd go back to Nick with questions, or like me and Coleslaw, my friend, would be on the phone like trying to figure it out, you know. So just that part being eliminated, just the fact that we're through that is immensely helpful. But
so the other thing to note is up to maybe 5 character length, it's viable to have a complete map of the hashes.
Yeah.
So that will make life a bit easier too.
Right.
You know, we don't know who what this name was.
Yeah.
6 and 7 were pushing it. And someone has a lot of storage lying around.
Yeah.
Up to 5 are pretty. So it sounds like one of the big things that we can do third-party reveals. You know, if you're willing to give someone your salt and your bid and the name hash, they will be able to reveal it for you. We're not saying that anyone should.
Not at present, unless they also place the bid, but it would be a relatively simple change.
I was going to say, I assume that's just a modifier rather than it's not inherent part of the system. So that might open up the opportunity for third-party systems that will automatically reveal for you. Because I mean, one of the other things we should be aware of is when we go to the next set of names, the numbers are probably going to be larger.
Absolutely.
So, you know, people bidding for X.com or X.ETH rather, you know, it's going to be a big number.
I think if we allow names shorter than 7 characters, probably that entire top bid list would have been names shorter than 7 characters.
Oh, yeah. We could find out people's favourite letters of the alphabet, that would be cool.
Yeah. Q was more popular than Z, who would have thought?
V was really popular.
Well, it already is, isn't it?
Exactly, everyone's bidding for it.
And there's one thing now about the auction process we found out is that about privacy. If someone starts an auction, we at a certain point we never started an auction because then you could find out what that person had bid on it. Then you could simply go for each cent and check the time and at least bid higher than that. So
You can get an upper bound on what the name almost certainly is.
Yeah.
Like if I enter Fubar Bears and they open that and 2 other names, the chances that it was one of those other 2 is pretty much 0, you know. But,
yeah, or simply look at the time. It says it was a day ago, a day and 4 hours or so.
But I guess I mean the masked names, you know, when you open a bid, it opens 2 other random ones, are only effective if you're sort of browsing names, not if you enter the targeted one, because the odds of them happening to bid on something else, as well as the name you're interested in, is very low.
But once they open the auction, I mean, they don't need to open it from the same account that they did from.
Yeah, so
But they just often do, and that's the issue.
Are you the one that does is it you guys that do you guys bid, you set the auctions all from one and then you bid from a different one?
No, we haven't done that. We thought about it, but it was too successful because, well, we simply overbid to make sure we don't lose.
So your first bid is low and then you do a second bid?
No, we don't. We simply bid very high, but we always, when someone else started an auction, we always looked what that person had bid on, generally. Sometimes we could see that a certain account had only, a couple of beaver, so we knew that, once we started bidding on in the double digits, we were safe.
Right, yeah, that's true. So the one thing that I saw that I thought was like very clever, the guy the My Ether Wallet guy, he basically he didn't do this for My Ether Wallet, but he started, what he did was like, that account will just start auctions. And that's it, and then he'll go and bid on those auctions from like a whole bunch of other accounts, and so it's very hard to tell what kind of like game you're playing, because like for me, like the one that I was looking at someone and I could see what else they bid on and stuff, and you can tell what game they're playing. You can tell if they're like, you know, if we're talking about they got 500,000 ETH, they got, you know, 0.5 ETH, and like there's people that'll bid on a lot of names with 0.5 ETH in their account, and you know all those bids are like 0.01. You know, and so if you wanted to name up against 500 ETH, you know, that was our, we were like, no way. It's, I don't know, I don't like name plotting. Like, just only go use your names.
Before lunch, does anyone else have any insights into postmortem for the soft launch?
I have one thing. So what about the web component of the DApp? So since we saw a huge growth in traffic from really the ENS launch, like I mentioned in my email, was the first huge traffic generating thing. There's some really interesting data that I'd like to collect and share with everybody based on that. But prior to the ENS, there really wasn't a DApp that stood out in terms of traffic generated on the network. Like we were saying, the network could go down, we could have intermittent downtimes here and there, and nobody really noticed until ENS. So now that more people are using these dApps, and there's things like Ether, Delta, and decentralized exchanges that seem to be the most popular things out there right now, what kinds of patterns have you thought about, or that you've seen that we can optimize before this next ENS release and even more traffic and having to scale with that? Because it's not just a problem for publicly hosted nodes. There are some dApps that'll deny of service your own local node based on just hitting it with get logs thousands of times when you load a site. I don't think people have realized if you open up your web developer console and you take a look at some of these dApps out there and how they're hitting your node, it's generating a lot of traffic, and it's not that efficient right now. And I don't think people are really thinking about that. They're just trying to get things working. But as people start having multiple dApps open, switching between things through whatever Ethereum browser they're using, it's going to be something that we're going to have to optimize.
So you're thinking about improvements to dApps, improvements to the JSON RPC interface, or improvements to the back end of the nodes, or all of the above?
Yeah, so not just So JSON RPC definitely, the pub sub model with Web 3 1.0 and everything will help, but there's more that that needs to be done there. People trying to move on to light clients, there are a lot of dApps that are out there right now that aren't compatible with the light clients because they're relying on a lot of the functionality exposed through the JSON RPC.
So did you see any pathological behavior from ENS dApps?
No, ENS was pretty well behaved compared to some of the other ICOs that we've seen that just say, oh, let's just hit Infera with like 10,000 requests in the first 5 seconds per user when they load our site, just so we can have like a pretty graph. And it's nothing too much there, except we just did a blog post the other day about get logs and how it's something that's critical for people that want to be able to have like a responsive UX on their site based on things happening. But the actual performance of that in the client implementations is just limited right now. But that's what people are using since that's all they can really have. So, any thoughts?
Well, I hope you'll present the stats on stuff you learned from that later, because I don't know about others, but I'd very much like to see that.
Okay, sure.
All right, I believe it's just about time for lunch. We'll give our current hosts another couple of minutes, I guess. One thing I neglected to mention this morning, for which I apologise, is I wanted to thank King's College for hosting us, and Peter in particular. So thank you very much. Cool. Nice.
I said that before.
All right. So.
Well, I've got something to mention as well. I need to confirm numbers with the restaurant for Saturday evening, and I need to know exactly how many people are going to come, whose dietary needs, vegan, vegetarian. So how do we do that?
If you haven't RSVP'd yes on the calendar, either because you couldn't or because you just didn't, please raise your hands.
Is it the Google one?
The Google Calendar, yes. For Saturday.
We're not talking about the meetup.
No, the Saturday's dinner. So we've got.
Can we just raise hands for everybody going now?
There might be people who are going like not physically here at the moment, is the only problem. So I think we've got 4 people on top of the RSVPs.
On top of the 80, 19, so 23.
Yeah.
And anybody that's vegan, we know of 1 person.
Can eat gluten.
Okay, gluten's fine. It's Greek, and they only have 1 dish that has gluten besides the bread.
Vegan.
Okay. So to
carnivore. Any vegetables.
So 2 vegan and 23 people. Yeah. And 1 gluten. Perfect. Thanks.
Yeah, sorry, I think I didn't register, so please put 1 on it.
24, 25.
I'm not sure. I'm trying to figure out if I did.
It's going to be fine. I mean, a few plus minus won't make any difference.
For anyone following along at home, I'm going to stop the broadcast and start a new one at 1 p.m. EST and resume. Everyone here, help yourself to lunch.